probably learned about ancient Greece as the birthplace of democracy, the cradle of Western philosophy, where Socrates questioned everything and Plato imagined perfect societies. But here's what your history teacher never told you. In the same Athens where citizens voted on laws, there were boys as young as 12 being sold in state-regulated brothels. While philosophers debated the nature of love in marble-columned academies, teenage slaves were being passed around symposiums like wine cups. And the most disturbing part, the same men who wrote our foundational texts on ethics and virtue were often the ones buying these boys. Imagine being 14 years old, your city has just fallen to Athens. Yesterday you were the son of a nobleman. Today, you're standing naked on a platform while men bid on you, not for your labour in the fields, not for your skills as a craftsman, but for how smooth your skin is, how long before your beard grows in. Because in ancient Greece, your value as a male concubine had an expiration date, and it was measured in the months before your voice changed. This isn't some obscure historical footnote. We have court transcripts, legal documents, even receipts. One Athenian politician paid 300 drachmas, about a year's wages for a skilled worker, for exclusive access to a boy named Theodotus. When another man tried to steal Theodotus away, it sparked a violent street brawl that ended up in court. The judge's ruling, the boy was property. The only question was who owned him. What you're about to discover will completely shatter your image of ancient Greece, because behind every great philosopher's treatise on love, there was likely a boy who had no choice in being loved. Behind every symposium celebrating male friendship, there were enslaved youths pouring wine while trying to avoid their master's wandering hands. And behind the marble statues of beautiful young men that fill our museums today, there were real boys whose beauty was their curse. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to take you inside the actual life of a male concubine in ancient Greece. Not the romanticised version you might have heard about, not the philosophical ideal that Plato wrote about, but the documented reality of what it meant to be a boy whose body was bought and sold in the birthplace of democracy. We'll start with Phaedo. You might recognise that name. Plato wrote an entire dialogue named after him. What Plato doesn't mention in that philosophical text is that Phaedo was a sex slave, captured when his city fell, sold to an Athenian brothel, forced to serve as clients day and night. Until Socrates, yes, that Socrates, walked past the brothel one day and decided to buy the boy's freedom. Not out of lust, but out of pity. And Phaedo would go on to become a philosopher himself. But for every Phaedo who escaped, there were hundreds whose names we'll never know. Boys who aged out at 17 and were discarded. Boys who took their own lives rather than endure another night. Boys whose stories were erased because they challenged the narrative of Greek greatness. Here's the thing that makes this even more twisted. Ancient Greece didn't just tolerate this system, they built an entire social framework around it. They had specific words to distinguish between different types of male concubines. They had laws regulating the practice. They had customs about what gifts were appropriate to give a boy you were courting versus one you were buying. They even had jokes about it in their comedies, where audiences would laugh at references to boys being passed around like party favours. The evidence isn't hidden in some dusty archive. It's right there in the texts we still teach in universities. Xenophon casually mentions masters sleeping with their slave boys as if he's discussing the weather. Aristophanes makes jokes about clients stealing their coins back from boy prostitutes after using them. Aeschylus dedicates an entire legal speech to destroying a political rival by revealing he was once a male concubine, describing in detail how the man lived with various older lovers in exchange for gifts and money. And yet somehow, when we talk about ancient Greece today, we focus on the Parthenon and democracy, and the birth of rational thought. We don't talk about the boy standing behind Plato at the symposium, refilling his wine cup and hoping tonight won't be the night he's chosen. We don't talk about the parents who sold their own sons when the crops failed. We don't talk about the systematic sexual exploitation that was so normalised they didn't even consider it worth hiding. But we need to talk about it. Because understanding the truth about male concubinage in ancient Greece reveals something crucial about how power, sexuality and exploitation have always been intertwined. It shows us that the societies we idealise were built on foundations of human suffering that we've chosen to forget. And most importantly, it gives voice to those boys whose own voices were never recorded, except when they were being bought, sold, or condemned. So let me take you back to Athens, 420 BCE. Peloponnesian War is raging. The city is flush with wealth from its empire. And in the Piraeus port district, where the brothels cluster near the docks, a new shipment of war captives has just arrived. Among them is a 13-year-old boy from Melos. His father was killed in the siege, his mother was sold to a different owner, and in about 10 minutes he's going to be purchased by a wealthy ceramic merchant who's been watching him since the ship docked. His name was Alexios. We know because it appears in a fragment of a legal document about property transfer, and his story represents thousands of others whose lives were destroyed by a system that we've spent 2,000 years romanticising. The merchant who bought Alexios wasn't some exception to Greek virtue. He was a respected citizen who served on juries and attended the assembly. By day, he voted on matters of justice and democracy. By night, he went home to a boy who had no legal right to refuse him anything. And according to the social norms of the time, there was nothing contradictory about this. The same society that gave us the concept of individual liberty had no problem with sexual slavery, as long as the slaves were young, beautiful, and male. To understand how this worked, you have to understand the Greek mind's twisted logic about sexuality and power. In their worldview, it wasn't shameful for a man to penetrate someone of lower status, whether that was a woman, a slave, or a boy. What was shameful was being penetrated if you were a free adult male. So they created this elaborate system where boys and young men could be used sexually until they became full citizens, at which point they were expected to switch roles and become the users themselves. It was a cycle of exploitation dressed up as tradition. The evidence for this isn't subtle. In one court case from 346 BCE, the prosecutor Aeschines goes into excruciating detail about how his opponent Timarchus lived as a kept boy in his youth. He names the men Timarchus stayed with. He describes the gifts he received: fancy clothes, expensive dinners, even cash payments. He talks about how Timarchus would move from one patron's house to another, essentially being a live-in prostitute for Athens' elite. And the terrifying thing, the jury convicted Timarchus based on this evidence, stripping him of his citizenship rights. Not because they thought male prostitution was wrong, but because a citizen who had prostituted himself was considered too degraded to participate in democracy. Think about that for a second. The same legal system that punished men for having been concubines in their youth did nothing to punish the men who bought them. The shame was entirely on the victim, never on the perpetrator. If you were rich enough to buy a boy, you were exercising your natural rights as a free man. If you were desperate enough to sell yourself as a boy, you were marked for life as less than human. The physical reality of being a male concubine was brutal. If you were a slave, you had absolutely no rights. Your master could beat you, starve you, or sell you to someone worse. If you resisted, you could be punished or killed with no legal consequences. We have artistic evidence of this. Vase paintings showing nude slave boys at symposiums being groped while they pour wine, their faces turned away in shame or resignation. The artists who painted these scenes weren't creating pornography, they were depicting normal daily life for Athens' upper class. Even for free boys who entered concubinage voluntarily, if you can call economic desperation voluntary, the situation was degrading. They had to carefully navigate the fiction that they were in relationships rather than being prostitutes. They accepted gifts rather than payment. They had to pretend affection for men who were essentially renting their bodies. One wrong move, asking for money too directly, refusing the wrong person, aging out of desirability, and they could find themselves on the street with no way to survive except moving to the actual brothels. And those brothels were everywhere. Solon, the lawgiver celebrated as one of Athens' founding fathers, allegedly established state-regulated brothels in the 6th century BCE. By the classical period, these establishments were as common as taverns. The comedian Aristophanes jokes about them constantly, referring to cheap cubicles near the agora, where boys waited behind thin doors for customers. Archaeological excavations have found small rooms that match these descriptions, clustered in specific districts, with explicit graffiti that leaves no doubt about their purpose. The prices tell their own tragic story. According to various sources, the going rate for a boy prostitute was between 1 and 3 obols, less than a day's wage for a labourer. But that was for common brothel boys. For something more exclusive, a beautiful war captive, a boy with musical talents, someone who could perform at symposiums, The prices could reach hundreds of drachmas. In one documented case, a man named Epicrates paid 40 minas to purchase a slave boy's freedom. That's 4,000 drachmas, enough to buy a modest house. The boy must have been extraordinary, or Epicrates must have been extraordinarily obsessed. The age of these boys is what makes this particularly horrifying by modern standards. While the exact ages are debated, the evidence points to boys as young as 12 being used as concubines. The idealised age for an eromenos, the younger partner in a pederastic relationship, was between 14 and 18. But for slave boys, there were no rules. If a master found a boy attractive, that boy's age was irrelevant. We have inscriptions and graffiti that make sexual references to little boys, using diminutives that suggest prepubescent children. The psychological damage must have been immense, though ancient sources rarely acknowledge it. We get glimpses, though. In Euripides' lost play about Chrysippus, a mythical youth abducted and raped by Laius, the surviving fragments suggest the boy killed himself from shame. While this was mythology, not history, the fact that Greek audiences found this reaction believable tells us they understood the trauma involved. They just didn't care enough to stop inflicting it. Some boys tried to make the best of their situation. They learned to manipulate their lovers, extracting gifts and favours while they still had their youth. Theonis, a 6th century poet, complains bitterly about boys who chase wealthy lovers for material gain rather than staying loyal to their original admirers. His poems reveal a subculture of savvy youths who understood their beauty was a depreciating asset and tried to maximise their returns before it faded. But even these relatively empowered boys were still trapped in a system where their value was measured in smoothness of skin and absence of body hair. The moment a boy's beard began to grow, his world changed completely. If he was a slave concubine, he might be sold off to work in mines or fields, a virtual death sentence after the relatively comfortable life of a household slave. If he was free, he faced a different kind of death, social obliteration. The same men who had pursued him when he was smooth-cheeked would now mock him if he tried to maintain his youthful appearance. Aristophanes makes cruel jokes about aging male prostitutes who pluck their body hair and use makeup to seem younger. The audience would have laughed because they recognised these desperate figures from real life. Some managed to transition to other roles. A few became procurers themselves, using their knowledge of the trade to run brothels or arrange liaisons. Others, if they had been lucky enough to receive education from their patrons, might find work as teachers or scribes. But many simply disappeared from the historical record, suggesting they fell into poverty, addiction, or early death. The suicide rate must have been significant, though it's never directly addressed in our sources. The philosophical schools that emerged from this same society had complicated relationships with male concubinage. Plato's Symposium, one of the most celebrated philosophical texts in Western tradition, is essentially a dinner party where men debate the nature of love between males. Pausanias, one of the speakers, tries to distinguish between noble love of the soul and base love of the body. But even as he condemns those who love boys purely for physical pleasure, he takes for granted that such relationships are common. He's not arguing they should stop, just that they should be more spiritual. Socrates himself presents a fascinating case. On one hand, he's credited with rescuing Phaedo from prostitution, recognizing the boy's intellectual potential and helping him become a philosopher. On the other hand, Socrates was constantly surrounded by beautiful young men who hung on his every word. While Plato insists these relationships were purely intellectual, other sources suggest Socrates wasn't always as chaste as his students claimed. Xenophon records him warning a young man that kissing a beautiful boy was like being bitten by a spider. You'd be driven mad with desire. The warning suggests personal experience. The hypocrisy reaches its peak with Plato himself. In his Republic, he imagines an ideal society with strict controls on sexuality. In his Laws, written later in life, he actually proposes banning homosexual intercourse entirely. Yet this is the same man who wrote gorgeous prose about the beauty of young men, who studied under Socrates in an environment suffused with pederastic culture, and who certainly knew that his fellow philosophers kept boy concubines. It's as if he could see the exploitation and abuse inherent in the system, but couldn't quite bring himself to condemn the men perpetrating it. Perhaps because they were his friends, his teachers, his social circle. The military added another dimension to this exploitation. Young soldiers often attached themselves to older veterans in relationships that mixed mentorship, protection, and sexual service. The sacred band of Thebes, celebrated as an elite military unit made up of male lovers, is often romanticized as an example of noble same-sex love. But consider the power dynamics. Older, experienced warriors paired with younger, vulnerable recruits. Were these really relationships of equals, or was this institutional sexual exploitation dressed up as military tradition? When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, he inherited a different tradition of male concubinage, one involving eunuchs. The Persians castrated boys to serve as safe bedmates who couldn't impregnate women or grow beards. Greeks had traditionally viewed this practice with disgust, seeing it as barbaric. But Alexander embraced it, taking the Persian eunuch Bagoas as his lover. The Macedonian soldiers initially resisted, but when Alexander publicly kissed Bagoas at a festival, they cheered. The conquest had changed their standards. What was once unthinkable became acceptable when practiced by their godlike leader. This moment represents a shift in Greek attitudes toward male concubinage. As the old city-state system gave way to Hellenistic kingdoms, the practice became both more visible and more extreme. Rulers kept harems of boys alongside their wives. Eunuchs gained political power as royal favourites. The pretense of pederasty as education fell away, replaced by naked exploitation of beauty and youth. Writers of the period describe courts where boys were collected like art objects, valued for their exotic origins or unusual features. The Roman conquest of Greece eventually brought new dynamics to this already complex situation. Romans had their own traditions of sexual exploitation, but they were somewhat different from Greek customs. They adopted the Greek practice of keeping boy concubines, but without the philosophical justifications. A Roman master might keep a young male slave for sexual purposes, but he wouldn't write poetry about the nobility of their love. It was pure dominance without the Greek pretense of education or mentorship. We know about individual boys whose names have survived by chance. There was Antinous, the Greek youth who became Emperor Hadrian's lover and was deified after drowning in the Nile. His statues are in museums worldwide, celebrated as examples of classical beauty. But strip away the marble polish, and you have a teenager from a conquered province who had no real choice when the most powerful man in the world decided he wanted him. There was Sporus, the boy Nero castrated and married in a public ceremony, forcing him to play the role of the emperor's dead wife. These aren't love stories, they're accounts of absolute power destroying young lives. Medical texts from the period reveal another horrifying dimension. Physicians wrote about treating the physical damage common among boy prostitutes and concubines. Anal fissures, infections, and what we would now recognise as sexually transmitted diseases were endemic. One medical writer describes treatments for boys who had been worn out by excessive use, a clinical way of describing rape victims. The same civilization that gave us the Hippocratic Oath was documenting the medical consequences of child sexual abuse without any apparent moral concern. The economic system that supported this exploitation was sophisticated. Pimps bought boys young, trained them in music, dance and conversation, then rented them out at symposiums or sold them to private owners. It was an investment, like buying a rental property. Some boys were branded or tattooed to mark them as prostitutes, a permanent reminder of their degradation that would follow them, even if they gained freedom. Tax records show that Athens collected revenue from registered prostitutes, both male and female. The state was literally profiting from sexual slavery. Parents sometimes sold their own children into this system. During famines or after military defeats, families might have no choice but to sell their youngest sons to survive. There are heart-wrenching references to fathers negotiating prices for their boys, trying to find buyers who might treat them less cruelly. Imagine being that parent, knowing exactly what you're condemning your child to, but having no other option. Imagine being that child sold by the very people who should protect you. The religious dimension adds another layer of complexity. Greek religion was full of myths about gods pursuing beautiful boys. Zeus abducted Ganymede to be his cupbearer, a euphemism everyone understood. Apollo loved Hyacinth, accidentally killing him in a discus accident. These stories normalize the idea that powerful beings naturally desired beautiful youths. Temple prostitution, while more commonly associated with female servants of Aphrodite, may have included boys as well. sacred and profane mixed in ways that seem incomprehensible to modern minds. Art and literature from the period constantly reinforce these dynamics. Red figure vases show bearded men offering gifts to nude boys, roosters, hares, money pouches. The boys are always depicted as smaller, younger, physically vulnerable. Sometimes they reach for the gifts eagerly. Sometimes they look away, their body language suggesting reluctance or shame. These weren't hidden in private collections. They were everyday pottery, used at symposiums where similar scenes played out in real life. The poetry is even more explicit. Straton of Sardis collected hundreds of epigrams about boy love in his Musa Paidique, the boyish muse. These poems describe everything from the first appearance of pubic hair, a tragedy for the lover, to techniques for seducing reluctant youths. They're often witty, sophisticated, and utterly immoral. The suffering of the boys themselves is never a concern. They're objects of desire, not subjects with feelings. Legal documents provide the most damning evidence. Contracts for the rental or sale of boy concubines. Court cases where men sue each other over access to particular boys. Inheritance documents where boys are listed alongside furniture and livestock as property to be passed down. One papyrus fragment from Egypt, then under Greek rule, records a man buying a boy for his son's 14th birthday, essentially purchasing a rape victim as a coming-of-age gift. The silence in our sources is sometimes as telling as what they say. We have thousands of texts from ancient Greece, but almost none from the perspective of the concubines themselves. Occasionally, a freedman who had been a concubine might be mentioned in passing, but their own words are never recorded. The boys who suffered in this system were systematically erased from history, their voices deemed unworthy of preservation. We know them only through the words of their exploiters. This erasure continues today in how we discuss ancient Greece. University courses on classical civilization mention pederasty in passing, if at all. Museum exhibits featuring Greek art rarely explain the dark realities behind those elegant vases depicting man-boy courtship. We've sanitized the past, keeping the philosophy and democracy, while discarding the uncomfortable truth about the suffering that supported that civilization. What can we learn from this dark chapter of history? First, that civilization and atrocity can coexist. The same society that produced democracy and philosophy also normalized child sexual abuse on a massive scale. Second, that exploitation becomes invisible when it's systematic. These practices were so embedded in Greek life that even their victims might not have recognized them as abuse. Third, that historical amnesia serves the powerful. By forgetting or romanticizing these horrors, we make it easier for similar exploitation to continue in new forms. The boys who suffered in ancient Greece deserve to be remembered, not as beautiful objects in museums or footnotes in philosophy texts, but as human beings whose lives were destroyed by a system that valued their bodies over their humanity. Their names are mostly lost, their voices silenced, their pain dismissed. But their existence challenges us to look honestly at the past and recognize that progress isn't inevitable, that any society, no matter how advanced, can normalize atrocity if it serves the powerful. When we read Plato's Symposium in philosophy class, we should remember the silent boys serving wine at that dinner party. When we admire Greek vases in museums, we should see not just artistic beauty, but evidence of systematic exploitation. When we celebrate Athenian democracy, we should acknowledge it was built on foundations of slavery and abuse. This isn't about condemning the past by modern standards. It's about honest historical memory that honors victims rather than erasing them. The tragedy of the male concubine in ancient Greece isn't just historical. It's a reminder that exploitation takes many forms, that abuse can be philosophized and poeticized until it seems noble, that power will always find ways to justify taking what it wants from the vulnerable. These boys from 2,000 years ago stand as witnesses to humanity's capacity for normalized cruelty. Their suffering demands we look clearly at the past, and just as clearly at our present. The least we can do is remember that they existed, that they suffered, and that their suffering mattered.